Hey guys, for today's tutorial we're going to work through a realistic simulation. We're going to create a spout and a glass, and we're going to basically create a water mesh coming out of the spout into the glass. We're going to work through a few new tools today inside of the RealFlow UI, and we're going to learn how to basically make our mesh look more realistic. So if you open up RealFlow, we're going to jump right in here. We're going to start by specifying a project directory. Now the best project directories to use are direct hard drives to your computer that have a fast transfer rate. This is so that you get more processing power out of your simulation. It writes and reads faster to your hard drive. So I'm just going to start by creating my project directory onto an eSATA drive here. I'm going to name it RealFlow Glass Sim 2. Okay, so now you got the scene here, and now I'm going to import the glass and spout obj file that I'll provide in the video. So as you see here, it's kind of rotated wrong. So I'm going to go into the node parameters here, and I'm going to rotate it 90 degrees on the x-axis. That way it is facing up the right way. Okay, now but before we actually start creating an emitter or daemons or any of that stuff, we're going to start by making sure our geometry is to scale and is the right size for our scene. So if you go down here to the bottom right, there's a little white box with a wrench next to it. You click that, it's going to bring up the scale options dialog box, and you're going to see it has geometry scale and then daemon force scales for grid fluids, particle fluids, and objects. They're all set to 1 by default, so close that for a second. And we're going to go tools here and open up our measure utility, and inside the measure utility it's going to show us the surface, the volume, and the volume of the bounding box for the object we have selected. So currently our object is 185,000 liters. That's a little bit big. That's more like the simulation for a small lake. We are not simulating a small lake, we're simulating a glass. So if we take a quick look here down at the actual scale options, we can decrease the actual scale for that. So if I go 0.05, I can then, the object is then a lot smaller, and I zoom selected on it. And if we look at the measure utility, this only takes 23 liters. Now the funny thing about RealFlow is it doesn't work very well with small scale simulations. So anything below 100 liters doesn't look good in RealFlow. It's always going to be too thick on the mesh, and it's just not going to look good. So my general rule for something of this size is to have our volume be anywhere from 100 to 200 liters. So I'm going to hit OK on my measure utility, and I'm going to go back to scale options, and I'm going to change the geometry scale to 0.1. Now if we go look at our measure utility again, we have a volume of 185 liters. That works good for me. I'm going to start working with that. And before I even start with that, I'm going to start by grouping our geometry. I'm going to rename this, not remove it, I'm going to rename it to geometry and place it inside our folder. Now I need to add an emitter and a gravity daemon and a kill volume daemon still. So let's start by adding a basic emitter. So I'm going to click the triple blue circle at the top. I'm going to add a circle emitter, and you'll notice that it's kind of big. So I'm going to start by scaling it down a bit, and scaling it down so it would possibly fit inside our emitter. So I'm going to move this over. I want this emitter to be a little bit past the halfway mark on our spout. That way it gets a nice run down the geometry before it actually enters into the cup. That way we get more turbulence and whatnot. Now you notice that we've scaled down our actual emitter here. But the issue is that our arrow here is still massive, and that's on the z-axis. Now if we take a quick look here, we can scale it down using the third variable here and enter 0.1 on the scale, or we can use the blue axis here on the scale and adjust it that way. So let's take a quick look here, and we need to move this into our actual emitter, and we should have it pointing down the spout. Now you see here that the arrow actually follows the green axis here on our rotate tool. So I'm going to rotate this so it points down the actual spout, and I'm going to move it. Now you want to be careful here to make sure that it doesn't intersect with any geometry or go outside of the spout. If it does that, then your emitter is going to have problems, and it's just going to emit the wrong way. It's going to go inside the geometry, or it's going to go outside of the spout. I want this to be more of an iris or an oval shape, so I'm going to decrease that so it looks more like that. And to make this interesting, I want to have it so it's pointing at the wall, like that. Something like that. That way, when we simulate it, it's going to bounce off the geometry, and it's going to be more interesting when it comes out. We're going to get more curls, more turbulence, and it's just going to look generally more interesting and appealing. So if we take a quick look here, I'm going to save this quickly. I'm going to simulate it, and you'll see that they just go directly out. They bounce off the object a little bit, but they just keep on going. Now this is because we don't have any emitter daemons in our scene yet. Now the daemon we use most of the time for realistic simulation is gravity, so we're going to add that one first. We don't need to adjust the settings on that because we're working with real world values. So let's move that over out of the way. And now we're going to also add a kill volume emitter just to make it so that none of the the particles actually escape our scene here. Now to make this easier on you, under your K volume rollout, you can select fit to object and then select the glass with spout, and it should automatically be constrained and uniform with our objects here. Now I'm going to go into the display rollout and make the icon so it's not visible, that way it doesn't get in the way of our simulation. Now if I select the circle here, I'm going to save this quickly and I then simulate it, you'll notice that the particles are now following gravity and they're bouncing off the geometry properly, but the issue is there's not nearly enough particles. Okay, so I'm going to reset it, and the rule here for our simulations is you work with a low resolution as you're trying to work out the tweaks with your mesh and as you're working with the physics, and then when it's finalized you bump up the resolution to something nice and high so that it comes out with good quality. So first I'm going to bump this up to say 100 and see how that looks, and you'll see down here that we get a warning saying that we have the none interpolation method selected. Now I'm not sure if I went over this in the last tutorial, but the difference between none, local, and global is that local is more of a finite computation method of where the particles are colliding, and the global is more lenient on the actual collisions and it's not as exact. Global is used for bigger simulations such as oceans and oceans, lakes, big simulations that take up a large scene. It's not as exact, so it doesn't take up as much resources. Local is for something smaller that needs more exact computation. So we're going to work with local because we're working with something smaller here. Now if I simulate this out, you'll see that we get a nice flow here, but this flow isn't nearly good enough for me. I think I want more detail as I'm working with this. So I'm obviously going to go back in here. I'm going to pump this up to 500, see how that looks. I'm going to reset it. And I'm going to go in here actually, and I think I want to make this emitter a little bit bigger, particularly on the x-axis to make it a little bit more wider. Now I want to make sure that it's also not colliding with anything, because if it is, then it's obviously going to go inside of our object here. So I'll show you, for example. You'll see that it's simulating here, but you're going to see here now that some of the particles are going down the spout like we want, some of them are going to be stuck inside of our geometry, and some of them are going outside of our geometry. We don't want that. We want it to be entirely down the spout, so I'm going to reset it, and I'm going to readjust it again, because, okay, looks fairly good. Now if I simulate this again, I would have a much higher resolution, but something not too strenuous on my computer, so I'm still rendering out at about 1 second per frame here, and I'm getting pretty good speed on this, but maybe I want the resolution to be a bit lower, because I'm going to simulate up to about frame 60 here when I test it. So now if I bump it down to 300, it's going a lot faster, about half a second per frame. That way it's only going to take about 30 seconds to 45 seconds to get up to frame 60, and I just want to see how these particles are colliding with my object, how they're interacting with each other, and it's looking pretty good. So the next steps for our tutorial here is we're going to work on animating our speed, and we're going to look at building meshes, and we're going to look at adjusting the actual properties of the child emitter inside of our mesh to make it look better. So I'm going to stop my simulation here. I'm going to take a quick look at actually animating my speed here. And before I do that, I want to adjust the randomness of this actual emitter itself. So I'm going to adjust the vertical random and H random to something small like 0.5, just so it doesn't look so computer generated. And that's looking pretty good. I'm also going to adjust the viscosity, make it lower, so that's not sticking together as much, so that it kind of spreads out a bit. I want more turbulence in my fluid. Viscosity causes your particles to stick together more. We're simulating water here. Water tends to stick together, but we want it to be a little bit looser because it's bouncing off the spout here and the gloss. So we're going to take a quick look at that. So now that we've done that, we want to animate the actual speed. I want to animate the speed so it slows up and speeds down so that it comes out slower and faster, so it seems like it's actually, you know, coming out of a bottle. And the reason for that is when water pours out of a bottle, you'll see that sorry about that, when water comes out of a bottle, the water is replaced by the air that comes into the bottle. So you get turbulence, or essentially waves, inside the bottle as the water is trying to pour out. So if I go down here to speed, I'm at frame 0. I want to actually set a key on this frame, so I can do this by right clicking and selecting add key. Now if I go ahead to frame 20, I can adjust the speed and bump it up, so I'm going to go back to my speed and change that to 3. You're going to notice now that the channel is now orange, and that means that there is an animated key on this channel. So I'm going to right click, add key again, go ahead to frame 40, and put it back down to 2. So now if you double click speed, it'll bring up the curve editor for our speed variable. So now you'll notice here that this is only being animated on frames 0 to 40. So to fix that, I want it to loop. So I'm going to select my last keyframe, I'm going to right click and go last node behavior, loop. Now it's now looping across our whole animation, but you'll see that the curves here are very linear, which doesn't look very nice in our animation. So let's select our last keyframe here again, change the node type to Bezier. So now we get a nice curve, but the first keyframe is still linear. So select the first keyframe, set node type to Bezier. So now we get a nice Bezier curve. So now it should be animated where it comes out slow, fast, and it's thicker, thinner, and it should look fairly good. It looks more realistic, and it's got a more realistic touch to it. So now let's take a quick look at actually adding a mesh to already simulated particles. So as you can tell, I don't have a mesh in my scene. In fact, my scene is very disorganized. So let's quickly change this and name our emitters and daemons so that they are more organized and so that we can find them easier. And we're going to also group them. So gravity, click those both, and then I'm going to group them and I'm going to name them daemons. Okay. Select our emitter. I'm going to rename this spout emitter. And then I'm going to add it to a group. I'm going to call that emitters. And the one thing we're missing now is a mesh. So if I select my emitter, I'm going to go up to the green kind of mesh. I'm going to select render, standard particle mesh. So it's now going to create a standard particle mesh with the spout emitter as the child emitter. And I'm going to also group this too. I'm going to put this into a group called meshes. And then I'm also going to rename it. And the reason I rename it is when we import it into 3ds Max or Maya or whatever proprietary software you're using, the mesh will be then, your object, your import will be named whatever you name your mesh. So I'm going to rename this, call it spout emitter mesh. That way when I import it into 3ds Max, it is then called spout emitter mesh. So now we have our mesh set up, and we have our particles, and we have our cup. But the thing we don't see is our mesh. So if we right click, I'm on frame 12. I've already simulated my particles up to frame 12. If I right click my mesh, I can select build, and it's going to build my mesh for that frame. Now the thing I want to look at right here is currently how this is colliding with my actual object, and currently it seems to be that it only goes through this face a little bit, which is good. That means that it's actually working fairly well, especially since I have 2 levels of faces here on my object. But if I want to adjust that, I'm going to go back down to particle fluid interaction and say my collision distance is too small, 0.016 is way too small. I want to bump that up to 0.02. That way it doesn't actually go through the first wall of polygons there. So if I'm going to reset that, I'm not going to reset it, I'm going to rebuild the mesh again. So I'm going to select build. You'll notice that it shouldn't go through the wall this time, but if it does, it's because I need to resimulate. So if I simulate again, I have my mesh set to build so I can actually see my mesh this time. So I see it's coming out, and good. That looks very good. Okay, so I'm going to select that. I'm going to remove that. Now the thing we need to also take a look at is under spout emitter we have these 2 fields called blend factor and radius. Now these work hand in hand with polygon size. And the reason that is I'll explain this in a second. Once I simulate this again, I'm going to simulate up to, say, frame 20. Okay, so blend factor is the combination of particles to create the mesh. So the higher the blend factor, the more particles are going to be combined to create a mesh around them. The lower the blend factor, the more exact the mesh is going to be to our particles. So if you have a mesh, a blend factor of 0.0, the mesh is going to be exactly around each and every last particle. So each of these little spheres here inside of our actual particle mesh, our particles, is going to have a very, very exact mesh around it. Now, radius is the radius from around these little spheres that the mesh is actually created. So the higher the radius, the further away the mesh is going to be. So the higher the blend factor, the less realistic our actual mesh is going to look like. Now, if you have a higher resolution on your mesh, you want the blend factor to be lower so that the actual mesh is closer to our particles. That way you get a more realistic simulation. And the same goes for our polygon size. The lower the polygon size, the more detailed it's going to be and tight to our actual particles. So if I wanted to adjust it and make it more realistic, I'd bump this down to something like 75 and say something on this 0.03. Save that. Now if I looked at our mesh now, you see how it's all weird and chunky. It doesn't look right. And that is because the radius is too small. So if I select our blend and build that again, you'll see, hey, cool. So now if I go back into here and I bump this down to 0.005 and rebuild the mesh, it's going to be more exact. It's really kind of chunky. That's because it's more exact. So we also need to play with our polygon size. So polygon size is currently 0.009. Maybe I'll work with something like 0.005. So let's rebuild that. You see the mesh is a lot more exact now, but maybe I'm going to work with something 0.004. Rebuild that again. And the mesh looks fairly good. Perfect. The mesh is very detailed. The blend factor and radius are very detailed, and they're optimized. The thing we have to do now is actually bump up our resolution. We're only working with a resolution of, say, 300 right now, and we want to have a resolution when we render. I'm thinking of something like 5,000, which is a lot higher than it is now. So if I'm going to save this, I'm going to reset this, and I'm going to show you how to build your mesh after you simulate your particles. The reason we do that is it saves time to actually simulate the particles first, and if there's something wrong, we can redo it. If you build the mesh and the particles at the same time, it's going to take a lot longer, and if you have something that goes wrong, you're going to be wasting a lot of time fixing it and then resimulating it again while you build the mesh. Now to do this, we set our mesh to build no. And now when we simulate, we only get particles. So we get the particles coming out. And what we're going to do is we're going to use a script to actually build all the mesh after the particles are done simulating. So if I'm up to frame 15 here, I got no meshes built yet. I'm going to go back to frame 0, and this little button up here with the little mesh and the green arrow, that's going to build your mesh for every cached frame. Now the cached frames are highlighted in yellow. So now if I select this, it is now going to build it for every frame. So you see here, I now have a mesh to work with. So I'm going to select this. Oh, cool, it looks great. Perfect. But now, I still need to adjust my resolution. So if I'm going to simulate this, I want to have a nice high resolution. So I'm going to bump this up to something, let's start working with 5,000, see how long it takes per frame. So it's taking about a second per frame here. To simulate this. That's a little bit too slow for me. That means the resolution is way too high, so let's bump this down to 3,000 and find a nice sweet spot. Okay, that's looking a lot better. That's a very detailed simulation. It's going to come out nice. There's going to be nice curls in there as it comes out, because you can see right now, you got nice curls here as it comes out of the actual geometry itself and into the glass. So I'm going to let this simulate, and I'm going to pause the video, and you can come back and my simulation will be done, and we'll continue from there. Okay guys, so now that we're back in here, I've simulated and I actually built my meshes. So you'll see here that I have the mesh built up until approximately frame 96. So if you want to see your mesh playback in real time, I'm going to put this on smooth shaded first. If you want to see your mesh playback in real time, you can go up to the playback menu up here, pull that down, you go click on video preview. It'll then generate your video preview here. Press escape to abort it when it hits the last cached frame that you have. So mine's frame 96. So on my timeline down here, it gets to frame 96, I'm going to hit escape. And it'll play back in real time, so 24 FPS. And you can see how your fluid looks. This is generally your review stage where you see if it looks the way that you want it. This is my final simulation, my final render. I'd export this now into 3ds Max, and then I'd probably subdivide it a little bit more, just so it's a little bit more detailed. And now this is playing back in real time. And it looks very good, very smooth, and I like the way that the actual collisions among the particles are working. It looks very good. So I'm happy with this, and I'm going to save it. and then I'm going to export it into 3ds Max. Anyways, this isn't a rendering tutorial, this is just a tutorial about actually achieving realism with the actual aesthetics and the physics of your simulation. So I hope this was helpful in some aspects. I will review, I'll release a tutorial on actually rendering it out in 3ds Max, either with Mental Ray or V-Ray in the next tutorial. So thank you for watching again, and have a good one. Cheers, bye now.